I am Suku Sengupta, the director for the Center for Indic Studies, and I'll just give you a very brief outline of the kind of activities that we do. We are a very active center on campus. We hold monthly seminar series, and within this monthly seminar series, there are three which we call the named series. One being the Gandhi lecture, which is in October of every year, commemorating Gandhiji's birthday. The other one is the Ram Samuj Arya lecture, which is in November of every year. And the most prestigious one being the one that we are holding today, called the Patanjali lecture series. I'll talk a little bit more about it a little later. But besides seminars, we do workshops. So for example, a very popular workshop that we have been holding for some time now, every summer, is a teacher training workshop. So the teachers who are the social studies teachers in middle school and high school in this country, how we can make sure that they represent Indic traditions, Indic religions, Indic cultures better in their teaching curriculum. For that, we hold this workshop where teachers come spend 5 days with us. We go over the different dharmic traditions, as we call it, the dharmic traditions workshop. So they learn about Hinduism, Jainism, Sikhism, Buddhism, and they also visit local places of worship of these religions, and it's kind of an immersion program. Then we also hold conferences. Almost every year we hold one conference. Our last major conference was the Vedanta Congress, which was last summer. Before that, 2 summers ago, we held the Waves Conference, which is a national conference. We also publish books. If you go to our website, you will see almost by now a dozen or more books that we have published. And we also publish 2 journals. One is the Journal on Ayurveda. It used to be called LOAJ, Light of Ayurveda Journal. Now it has been renamed to AJH, Ayurveda Journal of Health. And the other journal is on business practices in India. So we have a very robust academic kind of a framework. But coming back to today's, the reason we are here today, the Patanjali lecture. As I said, the Patanjali lecture is very special for us because when we founded this center in 2001, some of the faculty, we wanted to do a seminar based on something that we were very passionate about and were deeply interested in. And so the question came, well, how should we go about it? And in Indic tradition, there is tremendous respect given to a teacher, or in Sanskrit the word would be acharya. So we wanted it to be named for an acharya, and then if that's the case, then what better name than Patanjali? Because those of you who know of Patanjali, the first thing that comes to mind is his being an acharya. Now, in our tradition, in the Indic tradition, acharya is not just a teacher, because a teacher can impart knowledge, but an acharya, there are some Sanskrit verses which basically say that the teacher does not just teach, but instills in the student values based on the teacher's conduct, not just knowledge but conduct as well. And so since we decided to name it after Patanjali, the faculty at that time, we felt so strongly about it that we decided to make this series independent from the other seminars, and some of us faculty, we kind of put money from our own pockets to create the endowment that runs this seminar series. So with that, I would like to now introduce Jerry Solfin, whom I think most of you know. Jerry has been instrumental in this seminar series for a long time now, the sad part is that Jerry has decided to step down from this position, and so I would like to take this opportunity to personally thank him for all his efforts over the past so many years, and he has really made this seminar series so inclusive, so active. So thank you so much, Jerry. And Jerry will introduce our speaker.
Okay, so this is kind of a warm, cuddly feeling for me, being my last one. And also it's a great day because I got to meet Andrew Nicholson. We just had a nice drive back from the Boston airport earlier this morning, and it was delightful. And if that's any hint of what your lecture is going to be about, and I'm sure it is, you're in for a great trip, folks. In any case, let me say a couple things about this. I want to say that we've had some really fine lectures. I just went back for about 4 years to give you an idea of the Patanjali people. So in 2010, we had Eugene Taylor from Harvard and Saybrook Universities, the William James Scholar at Cambridge, and Cambridge at Harvard Medical School, to give a wonderful talk on, if I can read that correctly, William James on pure experience and samadhi, a message for experimental psychologists. All of these are available, by the way, on video and in printed form, digital form. Then the year after, in 2011, we were privileged to have a very well-known researcher and cardiologist, Bob Schneider, from Maharishi University of Management, who has really taken the world of alternative and complementary medicine by storm with his ideas, theories, and research, very powerful research he's been doing. And then the following year, we had another physically oriented person, Larry LaShawn, on healing self and other, normality as shared neurosis. And Larry loves to be ironic, and he loves kind of quirky titles, of which he chose that. And then last year we had the former editor of our journal, the Ayurvedic Journal of Health, which was Martina Ziska, who is MD, PhD, and also an Ayurvedic doctor. So this year we have a special guest, and I want to point out before I introduce Andrew, another guest we have here, and that's Matthew. Matthew is how we were led to Andrew. Matthew is from Bridgewater State University. Would you stand up and say hello? Yeah, because I hope to see you again here. This is Matthew Dasty, and he's well, I call him an Indic scholar. He would call himself a philosopher. Aspiring. A lover of knowledge, all right? So Matthew is a new friend that I met in finding people for this topic. Now, I'd like to introduce Andrew in this way. I'd like to say that the seminar this semester was themed on pluralism. And we had earlier in February, it was snowed out. You remember? We had a really bad winter. You remember that? In any case, we had to cancel, postpone at the last minute. And then in March, we had Rajiv Malhotra, who came and talked about his book and also pluralism. And then last month, we had a panel discussion of discussing Hindu, Jewish, Christian, Catholic, and Muslim, Quaker, and Buddhist theology on how they look at the word pluralism and how they deal with that in their work. In any case, today, to finish off this semester, we stumbled across, through Matthew's help, we stumbled across an Indic scholar who has something to say in his official work as an Indic scholar about pluralism. Pluralism is more of a kind of an everyday concept. But in fact, Andrew does have something very interesting to say about pluralism from the ancient texts and the ancient groups. In any case, Andrew is an associate professor of Hinduism and Indian intellectual history at Stony Brook University. That's State University of New York, Stony Brook. He holds degrees in religious studies, an MA from the University of Chicago, in philosophy, an MA from DePaul University, and South Asian languages and civilization, a PhD from the University of Chicago. He also has studied Sanskrit, Hindi, Indian philosophy, and yoga with teachers in India. Professor Nicholson's primary area of research is the history of Indian philosophy, most recently focusing on Vedanta, Samkhya, yoga, and Pasupata traditions. His first book, Unifying Hinduism, Philosophy and Identity in Indian Intellectual History, was published in 2010 by Columbia University Press as part of the South Asia Across the Disciplines book series. It won the 2011 award for Best First Book of the History of Religions from the American Academy of Religion. His newest book, which is this one, is that the good picture? No, I have a better picture there. His newest book, which has just come out this year, was published by the State University of New York Press. In any case, without further ado, I welcome Andrew Nicholson to as our 2014 distinguished lecturer in the Patanjali lecture series.
Thank you so much, Jerry, and I want to reciprocate. I really enjoyed our conversation. We talked about epistemological pluralism and Jain philosophy on the way over here. Not the kind of thing you talk about every day with people you meet, and after 5 minutes, hey, you're interested in epistemological pluralism, so am I. Great. So I'm sure he and I will have some other interesting discussions on Jain philosophy later. But today I'll be talking about a different topic, and I also want to thank Matthew, who kindly recommended me for the Patanjali Distinguished Lecture Series. And as I was telling him earlier, I get a lot of offers for things, and often I turn them down because I just am so busy. As many of you know who are professors, it's the end of the semester, we've got papers to grade. But I could not say no to a distinguished lecture series named after Patanjali. He did a good job at naming it. So I thought, well, okay, I'll come over and give the Patanjali Distinguished Lecture. And I will be talking a bit about Patanjali today, but in the context of this particular text that I just translated that Jerry talked about, a text named Lord Shiva-san, Ishvara Gita. And so this text itself refers and has strategies for dealing with the kind of pluralism that we find in classical India, in this case in the first millennium, around 8th century Common Era in India. Today I'll be discussing the section of the Kurma Purana, known as the Ishvara Gita, or Song of Lord Shiva, composed in approximately the 8th century by the Pashupatas, an early sect of Shiva worshippers. And you have a scorecard here. If you don't understand what I'm saying, so Ishvara Gita, Pashupatas are right there, and most of the texts I'll be referring to are on this sheet. The Ishvara Gita is very clearly patterned after the famous Bhagavad Gita of the Mahabharata, and for that reason, has been dismissed by some scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries as little more than an inferior copy. Although these Indologists were certainly right regarding the Ishvara Gita's frequent borrowings, they failed to ask the question, why did the authors of the Ishvara Gita imitate and at times reproduce entire verses from the Bhagavad Gita, influences that no intelligent reader could have missed? The Kurma Purana, and again this is here on your chart somewhere, I think, the Kurma Purana, is hardly alone in this borrowing. There are dozens of philosophical dialogues called Gitas, including, just to name a few, the Brahma Gita, Devi Gita, Ganesha Gita, Hanuman Gita, Rama Gita, Surya Gita, Yama Gita. We were talking about the Uddhava Gita and the Ashtavakra Gita there. So when people say the Gita, I was on which Gita? Which one? The Gita? So there are a lot of Gitas, and I think this, again, is a testament to the enormous pluralism that we find not just in contemporary India, but in medieval and classical India as well. Although those other Gitas are beyond the scope of my talk today, it is remarkable how little interest modern scholars have shown in all of these different Gitas. Perhaps this is because of a kind of mania for original sources, always wanting to go back to the very oldest one, the construction of quote-unquote classical Hinduism, and I think we see that sometimes when Patanjali is considered classical yoga. I'm not quite sure what that means, but for better or worse, he's considered the classical yoga. And the tendency to see later texts as products of a degenerate age. And again, this is another thing I think we have to get over, is thinking somehow because it's more recent, it's not as good. Many of my favorite philosophers, were not from 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, they're from 500 years ago, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with writing a text in 1500 instead of 1500 Common Era instead of 1500 BCE. My thesis is that the Ishvara Gita employs familiar language and concepts from the Bhagavad Gita and from the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali in a deliberate attempt to downplay the novelty of the Pashupata ideas they are presenting to a wider audience. Unlike the Pashupata Sutras and its commentary by Kaundinya, the Ishvara Gita is an exoteric work, not an esoteric work, that presents the main doctrines of the Pashupatas as a continuation rather than a repudiation of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. So this may not be well known, but a lot of people in classical India were actually very critical of Patanjali. And these Pashupatas, this group of Shiva worshippers, was one such group. At the same time, the Ishvara Gita insists on the ultimate supremacy of Pashupata philosophy and practice. Rather than understanding yoga as cessation of all mental activity, nirodha, as Patanjali does in the second sutra of his Yoga Sutras, the most famous of all the sutras, the one most yoga students know, the Ishvara Gita takes the highest yoga to be the acquisition of lordly powers through union with Lord Shiva. In more explicit terms than the Bhagavad Gita, the Ishvara Gita teaches that before a yogi is liberated, he must become a great lord, a Maheshvara, acquiring supernatural powers in this world. In foregrounding this aspect of the yogi's path, the Ishvara Gita has much in common with the Mokshadharma Parvan, another great discourse on yoga from the Mahabharata. But unlike the Mokshadharma Parvan, and unlike the Bhagavad Gita, in the Ishvara Gita it is Shiva as Pashupati, the master of beasts, Pashu, beast, Pati, master, who presents this highest philosophical teaching. And it is Shiva's powers, not the powers of Krishna or Vishnu, that the yogi seeks to attain by means of absorption in the highest Lord. The authors of the Ishvara Gita were acutely aware of this issue and were anxious to clarify the relationship between Shiva and Vishnu. Although sometimes presented as rivals elsewhere in the Puranas, in the Ishvara Gita, the two gods express nothing but mutual admiration. And this is what I was getting at, if you notice in my title. I didn't call it inter-religious dialogue, but rather intra-religious dialogue. A lot of my work, my previous book, Unifying Hinduism, and this recent book, is about the plurality within what we now think of as Hinduism itself. Hinduism is a more recent concept. You won't find the word Hindu or Hinduism in the Kuma Purana or the Mahabharata, but these Hindus, as we now label them, were themselves enormously diverse. And I think what we have here is an example of how one particular group tried to deal with this diversity, tried to make sense and find a kind of unity among this diversity. From the standpoint of the history of yoga, the most interesting section of the Ishvara Gita is its 11th and final chapter. The chapter has 146 verses and is by far the text's longest. And it is also the one that most clearly reveals its Pashupata origins. Yet it is also the chapter that borrows most heavily from the Bhagavad Gita and from Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Like many other parts of the Puranas, the Ishvara Gita uses hierarchical, inclusivist strategies to make sense of the diversity of religious practices and sects in medieval India. This includes subordination of the followers of Patanjali's yoga. Lord Shiva describes two types of yoga at the beginning of chapter 11. The yoga of non-being, Abhava Yoga, and the great yoga, which is called Maha Yoga. And here's what he says. The yoga in which one's own essence is known to be empty, free from false appearances, is named the yoga of non-being. Through it, one sees the self. The yoga in which one discerns the self as eternally blissful, free from blemish, and united with me, is called the great yoga of the Supreme Lord. Unquote. And it may sound like the yoga of non-being is Buddhist yoga. If you know a little bit of Sanskrit, this word empty, shunya, aha, that's Buddhist. Actually, I don't think that's what's going on here. Rather, my thesis is that it refers to cessative yogas, such as Patanjali's. These yogas do not understand the ultimate state of liberation or moksha as union with the supreme deity or ultimate reality. And if you read Patanjali carefully, for him, what he calls the Ishvara Pranidhana is a kind of lower step up to the highest form of yoga, samadhi. Such yogas enable the practitioner to discern the existence of a pure eternal self, free from material nature known as prakriti. But the yoga of non-being in texts like Patanjali's do not reveal the self's unity with Lord Shiva. So yogas like Patanjali are useful as a means to discriminate between the true eternal self and the egoistic self that is subject to change. This is a preparatory practice for liberation. But that kind of yoga, the cessative forms of yoga, the yoga of non-being, it's called here, these yogas are powerless to move the yogi from the dualistic discernment of the self's ontological difference from material nature to the higher knowledge of the self's oneness with God. This distinction between the two yogas is reminiscent of another text, Kaundinya's commentary on the Pashupata Sutras, also listed here on your sheet. There too, Samkhya and Patanjali yoga concepts are mentioned and given lower status than the yoga of the Pashupatas. But the way that Ishvara Gita and Kaundinya's commentary on the Pashupata Sutras present issues of religious and doctrinal diversity is different. The Ishvara Gita emphasizes the preliminary value of the yoga of non-being, the cessative approach to yoga, of which Patanjali's Yoga Sutras is the most famous example. By contrast, Kaundinya, in his Pashupata Sutras, belittles followers of Sankhya Yoga. He writes that, quote, "Those who have won supposed release through Sankhya Yoga, indeed all creatures, from Brahma down to the animals, are considered beasts," unquote. So this is another way of dealing with pluralism, is belittling your opponents, and we find this in the Pashupata Sutras. And again, I think we forget sometimes that within what we now call Hinduism, there was controversy and division and criticism. That's a part of Hindu tradition. I think a robust tradition of criticism and argument that is also part of Hinduism. So here Kaundinya is using this word pashu, beast, in a technical sense. It refers to any being in bondage who is yet to be liberated. Although followers of Patanjali argue otherwise, they cannot truly be liberated unless they recognize their fundamental unity with God. Hence Kaundinya calls them beasts. The Ishvara Gita, however, does not dwell on this deficiency. One later commentator on the Ishvara Gita, named Vijnana Bhikshu, who was a person I wrote about in my first book, even claims that knowledge of the self's unity with God is not necessary for liberation. There are a lot of different paths and a lot of different opinions about how to get liberated. Some people think you have to know Shiva, some people think you have to know Krishna or Vishnu. Vijnana Bhikshu said, well, even though God exists, it's not that important that you know that he exists, which is, I think, a pretty interesting and perplexing idea. For Westerners, we spend a lot of time arguing about the existence or non-existence of God. Vijnana Bhikshu said, well, God exists, but if you don't agree with me, that's no big deal. It's not an impediment to liberation. So again, these are, I think, refreshing ways of thinking about yoga and liberation and spiritual goals and their relationship to doctrines and theism and atheism. We can talk more about this later if you like. The Pashupata Sutras and their commentaries teach that the yogic adept undertakes a vow that consists of 3 stages. In the first stage, the Pashupata should live at or near a Shiva temple. He should bear the mark of the Pashupata ascetic by bathing in ash. This is something famous thing that worshippers of Shiva do. And he should worship Shiva with song, dance, laughter, and mantra repetition. So you've heard of laughter yoga? This is a classical precedent for the current Indian practice of laughter yoga. The initiate also adopts a set of moral precepts similar to those outlined by Patanjali, including non-harming, or ahimsa, celibacy, brahmacharya, and truthfulness, satya. The idea of yogis singing and dancing defies the common stereotype of yogis as solitary, stationary, and solely concerned with inward contemplation. Furthermore, these were not mere spontaneous gestures of devotion or simple oral folk traditions. Kaundinya says that the singing of the Pashupata yogi should be, quote, in accord with the Gandharva Shastra, a famous text on music, and his dancing, quote, in accord with the Natya Shastra, unquote. Many of you who practice Bharatanatyam are familiar with this. So presumably he was referring to the classic work composed by Bharata. And personally, if I'm going to follow a yoga path, I want to be able to dance and sing. I don't know about you. Although these passages may force us to adjust our ideas of what is proper behavior for a yogi, on second thought, it should hardly be surprising that medieval yogis would include training in dance as part of the path to union with Shiva. After all, Shiva is famous as Nataraja, the Lord of the Dance, and it is this form that is portrayed in the climactic chapter 5 of the Ishvara Gita, when Shiva displays his wondrous dance in the sky above the hermitage where the yogis he is giving his discourse to are assembled. And interestingly, this chapter 5 corresponds to chapter 11 of the Bhagavad Gita, where we have this vision of the ultimate form of Krishna. Well, here we have a vision of the ultimate form of Shiva, and it's a dancing form, which I like. The second of the 3 stages of the Pashupata has attracted more attention than almost all other aspects of the Pashupata path, as it involves transgressions of the normal conventions of society. This is reminiscent in some ways of the practice of shamelessness among the cynics of ancient Greece. There have been a few articles written about this similarity, and even wondering whether there might be some connection, either the Pashupatas influenced the cynics or the cynics in Greece influenced the Pashupatas. During this stage, the Pashupata yogi discards the mark or linga of the Pashupata ascetic and enters the public square snoring, trembling, limping, making obscene gestures to women, and babbling as if drunk or insane. His goal in this practice is to purify himself by receiving the abuse of others. All these behaviors are an act, as he has not given up his previous vows of celibacy or mindfulness. Instead, he engages in a different kind of spiritual exercise, one practiced only occasionally by Shaiva ascetics today. Since one of the most powerful human motivations is to receive praise and to avoid blame, by learning to, quote, despise praise like a poison, unquote, in the words of Kaundinya, and to take pleasure in insult, the Pashupata adept cuts off yet another tie that binds other more mainstream ascetics. So even an ascetic, look at me, I've got orange robes, I'm so pure and holy. Well, you have to get rid of these kinds of forms of egotism, kind of spiritual materialism, as Chogyam Trungpa would say, in order to be liberated. These practices earn the Pashupata's notoriety among other sects and philosophical traditions. In modern works on Indian philosophy and religion, they are still mentioned more often for this than for their strict ethical precepts or their theology of union with Shiva. In the third and final stage of the Pashupata vow, the adept withdraws from society and moves into a vacant house or a cave. Then, after 6 months of uninterrupted meditation on the syllable Om and on Shiva, he moves to a cremation ground. There he achieves complete union with Shiva, cutting off karma at its root. By the grace of Shiva, he achieves the end of suffering and eternal freedom. Although the Ishvara Gita's chapter 11 introduces the distinction between the two yogas, the yoga of non-being, corresponding to Patanjali's yoga, and the great yoga, corresponding to Pashupata yoga, it subsequently presents a fusion of Pashupata and Patanjali's yoga. The most obvious borrowing from Patanjali is the text's adoption of his 8 limbs, the famous Ashtanga. The Pashupata Sutras have actually a different way of enumerating the path of yoga, which includes more steps than Patanjali. So, 5 categories, 10 yamas or abstentions, and 10 niyamas or observances. So they very consciously go beyond the demands of Patanjali's yoga. Patanjali has 5 yamas or abstentions and 5 niyamas. Ishvara Gita verses 11:11 through 11:45 present a fairly straightforward summary of Patanjali's 8 limbs. And so you can sort of use this text also as an introduction to the 8-limbed yoga. Yet at the chapter's beginning, in its definition of the word yoga, it both alludes to and rejects Patanjali's understanding of yoga as chitta vritti nirodha, cessation of mental activity. That's that famous verse, the famous sutra, the second sutra of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. So here's how Lord Shiva himself begins his account of the 8 limbs of yoga. Quote, breath control, meditation, sense withdrawal, concentration, absorption, abstentions, observances, and posture. Best of sages, yoga is the focusing of the mind solely on me through cessation of other mental activity. I have just told you its 8 means. So here, after enumerating the 8 limbs of yoga, Lord Shiva gives a definition of yoga that is an allusion to and a departure from Patanjali's famous sutra, Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is the cessation of mental activity. According to the Ishvara Gita, the cessation of mental activity described by Patanjali is incomplete by itself, a mere means to the highest absorption in the Lord. This is accompanied by one-pointed mental focus, ekachittata, on Lord Shiva. Of course, meditation on the Lord does have some role to play in Patanjali's text. It is called Ishvara Pranidhana, and it is classified as one of the 5 observances, or niyamas, in his scheme. There it is one of the preliminary practices that eventually lead to the higher forms of meditation, and eventually to the transcendent state of aloneness, or kaivalya. But for the Ishvara Gita, mental focus on Lord Shiva is the highest yoga, while Patanjali's highest samadhi occupies a lower rung in the hierarchy of yogas. So this is one way we have of making sense of plurality, is creating hierarchies. And you have this one yoga worshipping Lord Shiva at the top, Patanjali somewhere below. It's also interesting, there's a controversy about what Patanjali meant by Ishvara Pranidhana. People translate it differently. Some people, like Barbara Stoller and Miller, are sort of more inclined to think of it as a kind of abstract contemplation. What's interesting about this text, and this is another reason I think reading similar text to Patanjali helps shed light on it, instead of calling this Ishvara Pranidhana, he calls it Ishvara Pujana, worship of Shiva. Something like all this singing and dancing stuff that we've been talking about. So at least in this context, that's how they understand the meaning of this aspect of yoga. Although the Ishvara Gita described his own teachings as Pashupata Yoga, many statements of the Ishvara Gita appear to contradict the teachings of the Pashupata Sutras as understood by its commentator, Kaundinya. One central issue is the question of who has the qualification, or adhikara, to practice Pashupata Yoga. Although Kaundinya understands only Brahmins to be qualified, there is no stipulation in the Ishvara Gita that the highest yoga is only open to Brahmins, nor is there any echo of the Pashupata Sutra's prohibition from interacting with people of the servant class, the Shudras, and women. And this is one thing that the Pashupatas are notorious for in the Pashupata Sutras, is a kind of Brahmanical chauvinism and a kind of misogyny. And that's interesting because we do not find that in this text. Kaundinya in the Pashupata Sutras is aware that in the course of begging for alms, the Pashupata mendicant will see and may even have to talk to Shudras and women. Maybe even a mlecha, a barbarian like me. God forbid we should make fun of these people, right? In the Pashupata Sutras, therefore, Kaundinya prescribes a purificatory ritual of bathing in ashes and pranayama, breath exercises, that the Pashupata yogi should practice whenever he sees urine, feces, a Shudra, or a woman. So you get an idea of what these Pashupatas originally thought about these people. So again, very concerned with ritual purity and ritual pollution in these earlier Pashupata texts. We can see from this that in spite of its influence on what would eventually become Tantric Shaivism, the Pashupatas who followed Kaundinya had drastically different attitudes to purity and pollution than did later Tantric yogis. Kaundinya's commentary is also notoriously misogynistic. In his discussion of celibacy, he describes women as poison and the root of all evils. And here I think, again, social context is helpful. These were sannyasis. They were struggling with their vows of brahmacharya, of not, they wanted to be celibate. And I think not just in Hindu texts, but also in Buddhist and Jain texts, we find sometimes a tendency to vilify women or to treat women as sort of seductresses who have to be avoided. And I think if we want to read a little bit into that psychologically or historically, we can see that as a kind of attempt by struggling monks to come to terms with brahmacharya, which for many men, and these Pashupatas were men, it's not easy. The Ishvara Gita, the text I'm talking about, however, shows no such hostility towards Shudras or women. Although it tends to focus on the life of the Brahmin male, as do most texts of this time period, it does not agree with Kaundinya that only Brahmin men can achieve liberation through union with Lord Shiva. Here, the Ishvara Gita instead follows the Bhagavad Gita's lead in suggesting that by the grace of Shiva, union with him is also a possibility for the lowborn. In chapter 4 of the Ishvara Gita, the text says, "Virtuous Brahmins, warriors, and merchants worship me. I grant them the state of bliss, the supreme abode. Even servants and others of low birth who pursue forbidden occupations are in time freed and joined to me if they are full of devotion." And here, if you know the Bhagavad Gita, well, I think you can hear resonances from some of the Bhagavad Gita verses. Even a dog cooker, even the lowest outcast, can be liberated. And what we find here is something similar. Maybe even hope for the barbarians in the room, like even lechas who don't have any caste. how can we account for the differences between the Ishvara Gita's portrayal of the Pashupata Yoga path and its portrayal in the earlier Pashupata Sutras? One intriguing possibility is that the Ishvara Gita expressed a kind of exoteric or mainstream form of Pashupatism. Although the Ishvara Gita repeats again and again the idea that its ideas are secret and should only be shared with a select few, in practice this was not the case. In contrast to the Pashupata Sutras, the Ishvara Gita was a part of the popular Kurma Purana, and the result would have had a wide readership among many different types of people, not only Shiva worshippers. If the Ishvara Gita was, as some have suggested, a later insertion into the Kurma Purana, a text originally associated with Vishnu worship, the Ishvara Gita may have been one of several attempts throughout the Puranas to mainstream Pashupatism by portraying it in a sympathetic and relatively sectarian, neutral light. It is also clear that not all of the authors of the various sections of the Kurma Purana had such a positive attitude toward the Pashupatas. Looking at the different parts that make up the Kurma Purana, the Pashupatas are more often celebrated than criticized, but some of the criticisms are quite severe. For instance, in the section that comes immediately after this one that I translated, we have a text called the Vyasa Gita, the Song of Vyasa. There are a lot of Gitas, as you might have figured out by now. And in this section of the same text, of the same Purana, the Pashupatas are criticized. This is what it says, quote, do not interact, even just in speech, with the heretics who engage in wrong action. Tantrics of the left hand, Pancharatras, and Pashupatas. Scary guys. What's interesting is that elsewhere in the Vyasa Gita, the Pashupatas are called heretics. This is Pashanda in Sanskrit, alongside Buddhists and Jains. So this is, again, I think it should make us think twice about our understanding about what Hinduism is, or there really wasn't a concept of Hinduism here. What there was a kind of contestation for who should be inside and who should be outside, who is Vedic and who is non-Vedic. And there wasn't a nice established list. I always tell my students that there's a list of the 6 Hindu schools of philosophy. That's totally wrong. There weren't just 6 schools of Hindu philosophy. There are lots and lots more, and nobody can quite agree who's inside and who's outside. So here we have a kind of contestation, an argument going on within this text itself about who gets to be an insider and who gets to be an outsider. So Vyasa warns that anyone who associates with people who, like the Pancharatras, the Buddhists, the Jains, the Pashupatas, those, if you associate with them, you won't be able to perform your ancestral rites, your Shraddha rites. And therefore you wouldn't be able to ensure that your ancestors would have a rebirth in the proper place. So it's clear that the Pashupata sect suffered from an image problem. And they still do. People make fun of them today. This problem was especially acute among Smarta Brahmin householders concerned with upholding the ritual order of their forefathers, which had come under attack by Buddhist, Jain, and Hindu renouncers. It is therefore especially notable that the Ishvara Gita moderates the Pashupata's hardline stance against the ritual sacrifice of animals. As did Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, the Pashupata Sutras maintained a strict adherence to ahimsa, non-harming or non-violence, in all situations, even when the Vedas explicitly demand performance of animal sacrifice. For the Vedic traditions, this was among the most threatening of these yogis' teachings. However, the Ishvara Gita contains a subtle and important redefinition of the concept of ahimsa. And this is actually on the back of the handout I gave you. Read along. The great sages define non-harming, ahimsa, as not causing pain anywhere, to any living being, whether through physical action, thoughts, or speech. There is no dharma higher than non-harming. It is the greatest happiness. But harming, when following Scripture's injunction, should be considered non-harming. So this conciliatory attitude, quite absent in the Pashupata Sutras, and indeed in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras shows a willingness to compromise on questions that many yogis would consider non-negotiable. Although everyday acts of violence, such as hunting animals for food, would still have violated this revised understanding of the teaching of ahimsa, non-harming, non-violence. It allows Vedic ritualists to continue to pursue their animal sacrifices without the taint of demerit. This concern for rapprochement between Pashupata yoga and Vedic sacrificial traditions, completely absent from the earlier Pashupata sutras, is a remarkable feature of the Ishvara Gita. And I think here, as I mentioned in the footnotes, they're borrowing from a text called Laws of Manu, which also makes a similar definition. Well, ahimsa is good, but when you're performing an animal sacrifice according to the Veda, himsa becomes ahimsa. Violence becomes non-violence. And again, I think this is a controversial issue to this day in India. Should Hindus engage in violence? Should we be absolute non-violence, as Gandhi preached? Should we be able to fight in wars? Should we be able to eat meat? Is that part of being a Hindu? This kind of contestation, this kind of pluralism of viewpoints was present here in the 8th century as well. The enumeration of the 8 limbs of yoga in chapter 11 of the Ishvara Gita transitions into an account of Pashupata visualization exercises, quite unlike anything found in the Yoga Sutras, the Bhagavad Gita, or their commentaries. These verses describe concrete, practical visualization exercises for the one-pointed mental focus described earlier. Although the text mentions 3 different exercises, I'll just give you a little taste by reading one of these. And this is also a meditation. I put this in the back of the sheet. Binding himself in the swastika, lotus, or half posture, his gaze resting evenly on the tip of his nose, with eyes slightly open, calm and free from fear, he renounces this world, consisting of magical power, maya. He concentrates on the Supreme Lord, the God, who resides in his own self. He then visualizes a lotus, 12 fingers long, from the root of his top knot. It is beautiful, blooming from the bulb that is Dharma. Its stalk is knowledge, the lordly powers its 8 petals. It is completely white. Renunciation is its seed cup. In that seed cup, you should visualize a sublime golden treasure. Consisting of all the powers, directly they call it Om, the divine eternal syllable, the unmanifest, surrounded by a network of rays. There he should think of a pure, supreme, eternal light. In that light he places his own self, which is identical to it. You should visualize the Lord, highest cause, standing in the middle of space, at last becoming the all-pervading Lord himself. He visualizes nothing. Are we all liberated yet? You can take this home and do this, do this at home if you like. This is one of the reasons I like this text. The Bhagavad Gita doesn't get this explicit. This text you can actually put on your nightstand and practice what it preaches. It should be apparent that this practice is not just a mental exercise by which the yogi visualizes himself as if he were Lord Shiva. Rather, it is a transformative practice through which the yogi becomes the Lord. Throughout the Ishvara Gita, accomplished yogis are called lords, Ishvaras, great lords, Maheshwaras, or lords of yoga, Yogeshwaras. There is a rhetorical blurring here. It is sometimes unclear when the word Lord, Ishvara, is used, if it is Lord Shiva or one of his followers who is meant. We may even take the title of the text itself, the Ishvara Gita, to refer both to Lord Shiva and to those Pashupatas who have become Shiva through their yogic practice. They're no longer beasts. Now they themselves are Shiva. This rhetorical strategy reinforces the central ontological commitment of the Pashupata philosophy. At the highest level of yoga, the difference between the meditating subject and the object of his meditation dissolves. The Ishvara Gita's one-pointed mental focus, Shiva, give me a text message here. Battery power. Low. I guess it's not plugged in. The computer's running out of battery. Doesn't matter. The Ishvara Gita's one-pointed mental focus on Shiva is ultimately no different than the union of the individual self with the Lord, described in Kaundinya's commentary in the earlier Pashupata Sutras. After detailing these visualization exercises, the Ishvara Gita proclaims, this Pashupata Yoga is for the liberation of all creatures from their fetters. It is the essence of all the Upanishads. Revealed texts declare that it transcends the stages of life. At this point, it is as if the authors of the Ishvara Gita realize that they have gone too far, revealed too much, departed too drastically from the paradigm of the Bhagavad Gita. For following this is a series of verses that borrow themes from the Bhagavad Gita, in some cases in word-for-word imitation. These 15 verses focus primarily on two themes: devotion to God, or bhakti, and abandonment of the fruits of actions. While the theme of devotion recurs throughout the Ishvara Gita, the theme of abandonment of fruits is relatively uncommon in the Ishvara Gita. This is one of the main differences between the Ishvara Gita and Bhagavad Gita. The authors of the Bhagavad Gita redefine the meaning of renunciation to make sense in Arjuna's warrior milieu. Renunciation means renunciation of the fruits, of the consequences, not renunciation of the acts themselves. The human characters of the Ishvara Gita, however, are Brahmin renouncers. One of its central themes is the renunciation of action and the practice of yoga, envisioned in similar ways to Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras. Like the Bhagavad Gita, another central concern of the Ishvara Gita is to establish the ultimate unity of the gods. However, the Ishvara Gita is primarily concerned with only two, Shiva and Narayana. Narayana, of course, is another name for the god Vishnu. He is present from the very first chapter of the Ishvara Gita as a kind of warm-up act before Shiva appears and begins his discourse to the sages. After Shiva's arrival, Narayana sits beside Shiva admiringly and listens to his teaching. And then, near the end of chapter 11, Shiva finally explains that he and Narayana are one, and there is no possibility of liberation for those who shun his divine friend. This is what he says, quote, I do not abide in those who see me as other, thinking that he and I, Vishnu and Shiva, are different gods. Those people go to terrible hells. I liberate those who take refuge in me, the fool and the scholar, the Brahmin and the dog cooker, but not one who reviles my friend Narayana. Therefore, to give me pleasure, my devotees should praise and honor him, the highest spirit, the great yogi. These are the last words that Lord Shiva utters in the Ishvara Gita. After Shiva departs, Narayana says a few words of praise of Shiva, and he too leaves the audience of sages. Here we see a concern to justify another apparent departure from the Bhagavad Gita, the shift from understanding Krishna as the highest god to the portrayal of Lord Shiva as supreme. Through Shiva's insistence that he and Narayana are one, the text attempts to preempt objections from worshippers of Narayana. This is not unlike the strategies in the Bhagavad Gita itself, which subordinates all other gods to Krishna, the god of the god, the Deva Deva. Krishna is the ultimate recipient of all other god sacrifices, according to the Bhagavad Gita. So, for instance, quote, when devoted men sacrifice to other deities with faith, they sacrifice to me, Arjuna, however aberrant the rites. I am the enjoyer and the Lord of all sacrifices. They do not know me in reality, and so they fail. Unquote. So that's Krishna speaking in the Bhagavad Gita. Of course, Shaivas can employ the same tactic with regard to Vishnu. And chapter 11 in the Ishvara Gita does just this, drawing upon the same language of those verses from the Bhagavad Gita. Quote, those who sacrifice to other deities for the enjoyment of pleasure receive fruits according to those deities. This much should be known. But if people who are devoted to other deities sacrifice to those deities while joined to me in thought, they too are actually freed. When someone completely abandons other gods who are not the Lord and takes refuge in me, the Lord, he goes to the highest abode. let us return to the question of who composed the Ishvara Gita and why it borrows so often from the Bhagavad Gita. We should first dismiss the idea that its authors were lazy, unoriginal, or suffering from writer's block. This is not, they had different attitudes about plagiarism than we do today, I think. Those of you who are grading papers right now, you know about this issue. It is more likely that the opposite is the case. Certain parts of the Ishvara Gita seem too original, seem to introduce ideas concerning yogic visualization and worship of the Shiva Linga that are too different from the Bhagavad Gita. The authors of the Ishvara Gita follow such novel sections with themes that every intelligent person will know immediately to be the same as the Bhagavad Gita. These sections enhance the text authority by showing that in spite of the apparent novelty of some of the text teachings, the two texts are in basic agreement about major themes. And commentators can say, well, I commented already on the Ishvara Gita, I don't need to comment on the Bhagavad Gita, because in the essence, they're the same. The rasa is the same. In the past 10 years, historians of Indian religions have paid new attention to the early Shaiva sects, among them the Pashupatas. One fact has become increasingly clear. The teachings of the Pashupatas, the first and most widespread of the Shaivas in early medieval India, could not simply be reduced to the teachings of the Pashupata Sutras, as some earlier scholars were wont to do. My colleague Travis Smith, working on another Pashupata text, the Skanda Purana, has suggested that the differences between the rigid casteism and sexism of Kaundinya's commentary and the relative openness of the Pashupata ideas expressed in the Puranas can be better understood by looking at the social and political history of the first millennium. For instance, it was the Pashupatas who between the 4th and 6th centuries Common Era brought the worship of Shiva to Varanasi. We assume it was always there, but they were innovators. They probably brought it there. In this second phase of Pashupatism, after the composition of the Pashupata Sutras, members of this sect received considerable royal patronage and actively recruited lay supporters. Mendicant ascetics, like Buddhist, Hindu, and Pashupata monks, require a source of food and material support, as their own rules prevent them from farming and from most types of business. As with the symbiotic relationship between early Buddhist monks and lay Buddhists, the Pashupatas established a foothold as priests in temples across India, supported by lay devotees who sought Lord Shiva's grace and his aid with their everyday concerns. In the Pashupatas' movement from the periphery to the mainstream of religious life, they left behind some of the extreme and forbidding aspects of the path described by Kaundinya, such as the prohibition of talking to women and Shudras. A kinder, gentler Pashupata teaching was born, and the Ishvara Gita, perhaps its most famous example. Of course, not everyone accepted the movement from the periphery to the mainstream of this sect of dreadlocked, ash-smeared yogis. If you've ever met any of these Shaiva guys, some of them are kind of sketchy, right? This conflict is reflected in those other parts of the Puranas where Pashupatas are shunned as dangerous heretics of the same sort as Buddhists and Jains. Members of established sects that understood Vishnu, not Shiva, to be the supreme god, were not swayed by the inclusivism of the Ishvara Gita. Although the new Pashupata attitude in the Puranas of emphasizing the value rather than the deficiencies of Vishnu and of Patanjali's yoga teachings is a departure from the earlier exclusivism of the Pashupata Sutras, the Ishvara Gita too says that ultimately all liberation occurs by the grace of Shiva. But eventually, by the second millennium of the Common Era, such disputes were ancient history, so to speak. Late medieval Vaishnava interpreters of the Puranas were willing to accept the teachings of the Ishvara Gita, declaring them the same in essence as the Bhagavad Gita. The attempt of the Ishvara Gita's authors to downplay the more extreme and challenging aspects of their sect's history had basically succeeded. As a result, the Ishvara Gita became a text widely accepted and commented on by non-Shaiva authors. The Pashupatas went from being one of the most reviled groups of Nastikas, or deniers, to being one of the established Astika, or affirmer schools of philosophy. And today, when the Pashupatas are remembered at all, They are remembered as just one colorful tile in the brilliant mosaic of Hinduism. Thanks very much.
What I was thinking was about reaction to Buddhism. I mean, there are many arguments which are made, especially about Bhagavad Gita, where the dilemma that Arjuna faces is basically the dilemma that comes from Buddhism shunning Hinsa and Hinduism's, not Hinduism, Vedic guys supporting Hinsa.
Yeah.
So where does this text stand?
That's a good question. In case you didn't hear, the question was a very good one about Buddhism and its relationship to the Bhagavad Gita, and I think you're right that many scholars today, I among them, think that among other things the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata is a response to Buddhist, not only Buddhist, but especially Buddhist ideas about ahimsa being important. And so the need to justify that in certain instances, himsa is necessary, especially if you're a kshatriya, especially if you're a king or a ruler. And this was a real problem. How can you be a non-violent ruler? What happens when your neighboring kingdom comes in and invades your kingdom? There has to be some role to play for self-defense. Nowadays, what Christians call a just war theory. Well, something similar like that, I think, is going on in the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata, where they're saying, look, there is a way of doing violence without being tainted by that violence. And that's, I think, where this very ingenious solution of palatyaga comes in, of abandoning the fruits of your actions. So you won't be tainted by an action, even a violent action, if you come to it with the right concentration or the right mindset. And of course that's considered the central teaching. Many people have considered this renunciation of the fruits of actions, Tilak, Gandhi, etc. They consider that the central teaching of the Gita. What's interesting about this text is it doesn't talk a whole lot about that, because this is primarily a renouncer text. And when for the Pashupatas, when they say ahimsa, they mean ahimsa. They mean complete and total ahimsa. That's in the earlier text I mentioned, the Pashupata Sutras. But again, what's interesting here is this group of Pashupatas seem to say, well, that's negotiable. We know that most people are not going to accept this kind of extreme non-violence that Pashupatas, Buddhists, and Jains adhere to. And that's okay, because in the quote I gave you on your sheet, if you're doing violence that is prescribed by the Vedas, then it's not violence anymore. That you're absolved from violence. And the Pashupata, I think when we talk about ahimsa, one of the reasons I translated it as non-harming instead of non-violence is I think some of the ideas we have about what non-violence or non-violence resistance means have sort of are different in this stage of ahimsa. For these guys, is not a kind of positive force for change in the world like it is for Gandhi. For Gandhi, ahimsa really was a kind of positive principle. You can use non-violent action and non-violence resistance to change the world. For these guys, it was very much a negative. You want to avoid the kind of ritual impurity that comes from engaging in violence. So therefore, the Pashupatas were like the Buddhists. They were not vegetarians. This is a kind of common mistake people make. The Buddha, for instance, anyone know how he died? He ate bad pork. So for these renouncers, they were taught to be disinterested to the extent that whatever you put in their begging bowl, they're not farmers, they're mendicants, whatever you put in that bowl, they eat. So as long as they themselves do not do the killing, they're not implicated in that violence. So this is the kind of older understanding, what one scholar even called a kind of egoistic ahimsa. Mm-hmm. I'm worried about what's going to happen to me and how I can be pure. That's very different, I think, than Gandhi's, very non-egoistic understanding of ahimsa. And this again is an illustration of the way that these Indian ideas develop and change over time. So that's a very long answer to a very short question, but I think my basic answer would be, this text, like so many Hindu texts, he's deeply conflicted about this very question of himself. And it kind of wants to have it both ways. The Pashupatis, the earliest Pashupatis said, no violence whatsoever. This text says, well, non-violence is a wonderful thing. It's the best of all the abstentions. It's the first and best of those abstentions, just like it is for Patanjali. And commentators on Patanjali say the same thing. If you do any violence, even violence enjoined by the Veda, you're going to go to hell. That's what Vyasa's commentary on Patanjali says. But this text says, well, maybe we were being a little bit harsh on you, Vedic Pranam. It's okay. You can engage in Vedic sacrifice. That won't make you impure. And so there's this, I think, very fundamental contradiction within traditions we now consider Hindu between nonviolence and the practical necessities, whether it be ruling and being a king and fighting in wars, or being a Brahmin and doing your job as you understand it, according to the Vedas. You have a follow-up? Yeah.
A follow-up question.
Okay.
So, but when do the Brahmins become vegetarian?
That is also a complicated question, and there are still a few Brahmins. I have a few friends who are not vegetarians, but certainly I think eating beef has sort of been a mark, and it's now becoming like a political football people throw around in India, right?
Yeah.
So, again, this may not be a popular opinion, but I think most historians are agreed that there was sacrifice of not just goats and sheep, but actual cattle sacrifice during Vedic times. At a certain point, probably sometime after this Buddhist and Jain critique of violence, ahimsa becomes incorporated into Hinduism as well. And it's very complicated to say exactly when it happened, but sometime probably in the first millennium it became less and less acceptable to engage in these kind of violent actions. And there are rules of Vedic substitution, where you can do a Vedic sacrifice without literally killing the goat. You can substitute some kind of, beet juice or something that has the same kind of red material and get the same benefit from the sacrifice without engaging in ahimsa, which many people are uncomfortable with. So my answer to that question is I don't know, but sometime between today and when the Buddhists got to India, I would say sometime before the modern period, it became looked down upon to engage in these kinds of animal sacrifices. And this is interesting too. He talks about in the Bhagavad Gita sacrificing the fruits of your actions. I think it's important. The fruit there is the phala, the fall in Hindi, right? And this is meant to be a kind of play on words. It's the consequences of your actions, but it's also the bananas you give to the Lord when you go into the temple. That's fruit too. So this is a kind of sacrifice you're giving. And so over time, vegetarian sacrifices were encouraged and meat sacrifices were discouraged, although you'll find, if you go to Calcutta today, you'll find plenty of bala, or bloody sacrifices as well. So still today, I think there's this misapprehension that all Hindus are vegetarians, they don't engage in animal sacrifice. I mean, I have students who, in my Hinduism class, we have so many desis at Stony Brook. One woman told me after I was describing this Durga Puja festival, she said, "Thank you so much. When I was 8 years old, my parents took me to this temple in Andhra Pradesh, and they killed this demon, and killed this buffalo demon in the form of a real buffalo, and it freaked me out, and no one explained to me what was going on now. Now, finally, I understand what they were doing there for Durga Puja." So I think there's this kind of official position, Hindus, we never engage in violence, but if you look carefully, historically there has been violence, including violence against cattle, and to this day, nowadays not so much Vedic violence, so much as violence associated with tantric traditions, worshippers of the goddess or with Shiva, to engage in these kinds of blood sacrifice sometimes. David?
So I appreciated that your talk kind of touched on a meta-pluralism, pluralistic views on pluralism.
Yeah.
And I was wondering in particular this kind of notion that you mentioned from the Ishvara Gita of, really Vishnu and Shiva are one. Whether you've seen pushback on that reminded me of, there's a Puranic text describing aparadhas against the name of Vishnu. And it says, Shivasya Shri Vishnoryam Yam Ninnam Pashyet. And there's an interesting sort of subject where...
Translate that for everyone who doesn't know Sanskrit.
So one who sees,
right.
by their thought. And then there's an ambiguity whether it's abhinna or minna, a difference between Shiva and Vishnu, or a non-difference between Shiva and Vishnu. I would think my preferred, what I think is a straightforward reading is one who sees a difference.
Yeah,
but
it could be non-difference.
But I've seen these later traditions that come in and say, no, pull an A off there, one who sees non-difference, or one who sees difference as opposed to subordination. So they take what seems to be a inclusivistic text and sort of kind of invest it with these sectarian kind of ideas. So I'm wondering if that same kind of pushback, you've seen that in responses to the Ishmael
which Purana was that in, the pushback? Was it the abhinna business? Was it a Purana or was it something from...
It was Puranic text that later interpreters were sort of, interpreting in different ways, reading it as...
Do you remember which Purana that was from, actually? It could be this one, I mean, because they use the word abhinna in there. The thing I translated, whoever sees me is different.
Yeah. Sorry, I was working with this stuff a few months ago. It's probably December or Padma.
So there's this, for those of you who don't know Sanskrit, there's this infuriating tendency in Sanskrit. Oftentimes you don't know if a word means itself or its opposite, depending on how the rules of euphonic combination sandhi work, and so that's the case here. So yeah, I think here they do use the word abhinna, that you should see Narayana and Shiva as non-different, ultimately the same. And I haven't seen that pushback, although, I mean, I haven't seen this explicit point made in the way that you say, but certainly there are many sects, including earlier Shaiva sects, who would completely reject that notion. So, I was talking about inclusivism versus exclusivism. There's a famous article by a scholar named Heinrich von Stietenkron who says in this very important Shaiva ritual text, Soma Shambhu Padati, that it's very clear, if you're not a Shaiva, you're going to hell, and there's no two ways about it, and you have to convert. And this is very clearly kind of anti-inclusivism and pro-exclusivism. And so sometimes people ask me, what is the official Hindu attitude towards pluralism in the classical period? Is it inclusivistic? Is it exclusivistic? And my answer is yes. There's so much diversity, as you said, there's a kind of, among discourses about pluralism. I would say, from what I've seen, and you probably agree with me, that the overarching tendency is a kind of inclusivistic tendency. That's why you translate it as abhinna, non-difference instead of bhinna. But there are exceptions to that tendency, where you want to include the other gods as part of your god, or show how other sects, like in this case, other yogas, are a kind of preparatory practice for your yoga. That is the overarching tendency we find in the period we're talking about, the first half of the second millennium. But there are exceptions to that inclusivism. I should probably also say a word. Sometimes this is characterized as Hindu tolerance. I don't like using that word because it's closely associated with modern Western ideas, letter concerning tolerance. Just sort of, there are a lot of different groups, but we're secular here, so we're just going to let you be, and we're going to just go over here and you go over there. That is not. Vivekananda had a great quote. I quoted him in my last chapter of my first book about this. He says, I don't just want to tolerate these other groups, I want to embrace these other groups. And in some cases, this is a kind of smothering embrace. I think that's what you find here is, we love you so much, Narayana, we're going to incorporate you into our sect of Shaivism. So this is not a kind of radical pluralism where each path is equal to every other path, or John Hick, the famous philosopher of religion, where we all have sort of the mountain and we all have separate paths leading to the same summit. I don't think that is what's going on here. They're not saying everyone is equal. They're saying everybody is good, but some of you are better than others. That is how I would characterize this form of what I'm calling inclusivism. And it's a way of diffusing tensions, and I think a very common way. So for instance, even Christians nowadays, I think Christians are sometimes stereotyped as being a bunch of exclusivists. If you're not one of us, you're going to hell. But if you look carefully, most of the mainstream Protestant denominations, including the Roman Catholicism since Vatican II, have had precisely this inclusivist position. There are rays of truth, according to Vatican II, and all these other traditions, but they are partial approximations of the absolute truth that we have through Jesus Christ. And so there too we have not an exclusivism, not a kind of radical acceptance where all traditions are equal. That can get pretty problematic pretty fast. Is the Church of Satan equal to, we have to have some way of saying, well, that doesn't count. Be Scientology or whatever you feel about them. Or did you hear about this new? There's a statue to Satan going up in Oklahoma City. So this Satanist group, they protested. You can have your 10 Commandments there. Well, we believe in freedom of religion, and the government has to be equal towards all religions. So Satanism should also have its own statue in front of the courthouse. Jerry and I were having a conversation with the flying spaghetti monster earlier. What's to prevent you from, if the state has to have an equal attitude towards all these different religions, if it's going to get pretty crowded pretty quickly in all the state capitals with all the different. There was Hanuman. Someone tried to erect a Hanuman in Oklahoma City. Now they're trying to erect Satan there. So, and these kind of point to some of the inherent tensions within secularism itself. This is a much broader question. But the idea of secularism is not an idea these people had. And this is where I disagree with some scholars like Amartya Sen. He wrote a book which really, I think, tried to sort of read modern Western Enlightenment secularist ideas and tolerance back into Indian history. I don't think that's the right way of talking about these things, which is fine. Secularism has big problems, I don't agree with your previous speaker, Rajiv Malhotra, often, but I do concede that secularism, whether it's Indian secularism, French secularism, or American secularism, is inherently unstable. It's a kind of compromise that is based on certain ideas about what religion is, what the relationship between church and state are, that are mistaken and rather confused. And I think many of the arguments we have, whether in California you're allowed to practice yoga in school, or conversations they're having right now in India about various things, or whether you're allowed to wear a veil in public schools in France, all of these come out of a very sort of contested and messy legacy of secularism. Last question, anyone want to? Yes, Matthew.
It struck me while you were navigating a very interesting, by the way, Jerry, tell me if I should yell.
Yeah.
Okay, so while you were navigating the very interesting, I was imagining like a double helix, the Bhagavad Gita and Ishvara Gita. Here's where they converge and here's where they diverge. One issue of pluralism struck me that where the Bhagavad, so both traditions are looking back on the Vedic ancestry and critiquing it. And it struck me that, as you so clearly put it, Ishvara Gita is very, it really wants to avoid hostility and criticism. The Bhagavad Gita is profoundly hostile. And the way of Vedic living is antithetical to the yogic lifestyle.
Right.
Although it is wrong about this. You cannot be a yogi and live like a Vedic householder sacrificing things they would normally live.
Right.
Different attitudes.
Right.
I'm wondering if you could give your opinions on why that is. I mean, there's so many interesting. The Bhagavad Gita is also, on the whole, against renouncing the world.
Right.
Whereas these Shaivas are ascetics. So,
Right.
do you have any light to
So
shed on
this is where it gets incredibly complicated and messy, but I think I agree with you absolutely. The Bhagavad Gita is sort of threading a needle between, on the one hand, Vedic ritualism, on the other hand, these renouncing traditions like Buddhism. And that's where this ingenious concept of renunciation of fruit comes out of. One of my favorite and most surprising verses in the second chapter of the Gita is that I'll paraphrase it, for someone who has true insight or true wisdom, knowing the Veda is like drawing from a well when there's a flood of water on all sides. In other words, the Veda is useless, at least as it's normally interpreted by these Vedic renouncers. And Gandhi, when he's confronted with this passage, gives it a kind of very brief gloss, and he says, other people have a different opinion about this, but let's not pay any attention to that. There's anti-Vedic rhetoric within the Bhagavad Gita itself, certainly the understanding that when one sacrifices, one has to be attached, one has to have some interest as a prerequisite for this very sacrifice itself. The Bhagavad Gita is already against that. Frankly, I don't think the Ishvara Gita has as coherent a position on that as the Bhagavad Gita does. The Bhagavad Gita has this ingenious answer of renunciation of the fruits. The Ishvara Gita doesn't mention renunciation of fruits until very late. It keeps talking about itself as being on the Ati Marga, and Ati means the path beyond, and Ati Ashrama, beyond the 4 ashramas, there's a 5th ashrama. That is the Pashupata ashrama. So we are better than you other renouncers. You are still worried about things that we've gone way beyond. And so it's very much, even as I didn't talk much about it, but in the milieu, it's Shiva talking to a bunch of renouncers. He's not talking to householders, he's not talking to warriors, he's talking to renouncers and what renouncers should do. And so, for most of the text, this issue is, well, you're a renouncer, there's no tension there. But then at the very end, there's a bunch of interpolations from the Bhagavad Gita, and there's this thing I mentioned about when you do violence in Vedic sacrifice, it's non-violence. So somebody, somewhere, and again, it's very hard to know the entire history of this text, but somebody wanted to make very sure that, okay, we don't want to offend the Vedic pronouncers. One possible reading is, Shaivas at this time were still in the minority in many parts of India, and they had a kind of defensive attitude. You can afford to be an exclusivist when, like we have in America today, 80% or 85% of the people are Christians. But when 5% of the people are Shaivas and another, I don't know, who knows what the statistics were, but say 50% were Vaishnavas, you're not going to go around saying you Vaishnavas are all going to hell. That's going to be a problem, right? So one interpretation of inclusivism Paul Hocker gave is inclusivism is a kind of strategy that minority groups use as a discourse with regard to majority groups. I don't think that's universally true, but it does seem like one strategy that you can use so as not to offend groups that are powerful or in control. So that might be one partial answer, but I mean, we need so much more research on social history and epigraphy and the dating of the different Purans before we can really say anything decisive about, why these groups were saying the things we did in these texts. It's a very difficult question.
Thank you very much.